Testing. Okay, it works.
Let me see the battery. Hold on, let me check your battery. Talk.
I think it works. Testing. It works. Good morning, everyone. We will start in just a couple of minutes, so please feel free to get your coffee and donuts and then join us up here in the seats when you're ready. Yes. Thank you. All right, well, good morning, everyone. Good morning again, second good morning. So grateful that you all are here. We're going to go ahead and get started. Feel free to grab your coffee and donuts and make your way to the front. We are so grateful and honored to have with us Lerita Coleman Brown. She is the author of the Lenten book that we are invited to read together as a parish. If this is the first time you're hearing about that, it is fine, because we intentionally had the author forum now so that you have time to go and buy the book wherever books are sold. This is what it looks like, What Makes You Come Alive, A Spiritual Walk with Howard Thurman. So as we did in Lent, in 2 weeks, we'll start our discussions, and you can find in the bulletin announcements what chapters we'll be reading and discussing together. So we hope that you'll make a point to take advantage of this opportunity. So Dr. Lerita Coleman Brown is a retreat leader, a speaker, a spiritual companion, and professor emerita of psychology at Agnes Scott College. She has a PhD from Harvard University, a certificate from the Shalom Institute for Spiritual Formation. She's written many essays, an edited volume. Her first book was entitled When the Heart Speaks, Listen, Discovering Inner Wisdom. She's been featured in PBS documentaries about Howard Thurman and the Black Church. And we're so lucky that she lives close by in Stone Mountain, Georgia, with her husband, Columbus, who is here today. So again, thank you so much for coming and being with us this morning. I want to begin by asking, really, if you wouldn't mind sharing some of your own spiritual journey. Your book teaches us about how to nurture a contemplative life. It shows us how those practices help us support our own activism and public engagement and service. And as the subtitle suggests, you draw quite a lot on Howard Thurman. So we'll be talking a lot about Thurman over the next 45 minutes. But we also just want to get to know you. And so I'd love it if you wouldn't mind sharing with us some of your spiritual journey and how you found your way to Howard Thurman.
Well, good morning, and thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm just delighted. I'm always delighted to talk about Howard Thurman and about his living wisdom, because I think it continues to feed us. I think that there are certain people who are born mystics or born contemplatives, although as children we often don't know how to name it. And we just know that we are drawn into certain kinds of activities. And for me, mine was sitting out in the wind. I as young as 4 years old, I used to go outside in our yard, and I grew up in Pasadena. With the Santa Ana winds, a little warm side, and I would just sit there. It was very peaceful and very calming. And at the time, I didn't realize that that was my connection to spirit, that was my connection to God. And so I think that I was just one of these people that happened to love and be drawn to stillness. I love stillness. And oftentimes it's very evident in nature and outside. As a college student, I was very intrigued with, I actually was raised Catholic, but as a college student, I was very interested in spirituality and started reading a lot about it. Tried out TM, as many people did at a certain point, and then kind of dropped it. But later, began to go back to that and to engage in yoga, in silent retreats, in journaling, and now, of course, practice centering prayer or contemplative prayer on a regular basis. But I just found that it's very, how do I want to call it? very important for us to stop and pause and be quiet and be with God in all the ways that are possible. And I certainly think that the contemplative life offers lots of that.
Well, before we get to Thurman, and maybe we'll use Thurman to answer this question, but your last comment makes me think that really one of the sort of basic concepts or insights about prayer that you highlight is that we often think of prayer as words, and as Episcopalians, we have a lot of words. They're written down. We read them every week. But the contemplative life of prayer really also focuses perhaps first or primarily on prayer as listening, and you make that point very clearly in the book. So I'm wondering if you might reflect with us about when we're listening for God, what does God sound like? How do you know that it's God's voice who speaks to you?
Well, I think it's Thomas Keating that says, God's language is silence and everything else is a bad translation. So, but my sense is that, and my inspiration often comes when I settle down. I mean, I think we do have to get still to experience God, and I think it's really important for us to, and even Thurman has written a meditation, a lull in doing, right? So I think it's important for us every day, and sometimes throughout the day, to just pause and to extricate ourselves from the vortex of busyness. That's what I call it, the vortex of busyness, so that we can actually experience God's presence with us in that moment.
Yes.
But I think it's important because, as I said in the book, that it's one thing to ask for something, but it's also important to listen for the answer.
Yes.
Right. And that's part of what is emphasized, is that we have this inner guidance, but do we ever stop and are quiet enough to hear it? For it to actually be able to get through all the noise.
Yeah, I love an anecdote, or maybe it's an anecdote that happens many times over in the book, where you talk about that, people often say, I'm praying and I'm trying to seek an answer, but I'm just sort of disappointed. And you just ask, well, what have you heard? And that's just it already sort of puts people on it's not just about me speaking. It opens up the possibility that we can hear from God, which is hopeful.
And, I actually have had a long history of a number of medical issues, including a heart transplant and a kidney transplant. And so been in and out the hospital in a variety of different ways. And it is a great form of discernment. Sometimes I've had to tell doctors, I think we need to do something, and there have been other times when I've actually said no. And a lot of that comes from my taking that into prayer and sitting with it and listening for what it is that I should or should not do.
Yes. Well, before we get ahead of ourselves, I guess we should introduce everyone to Howard Thurman, who may not know him. Some of us do know of Howard Thurman. If you're in EFM, Education for Ministry, you probably read some or all of probably his most famous book, Jesus and the Disinherited. If you've done the Sacred Ground curriculum, the anti-racism curriculum through the National Church, you'll be familiar with Howard Thurman. But Thurman was an ordained pastor, a university professor and dean, and a spiritual advisor to Dr. King and to a lot of the civil rights leaders. So could you just sort of walk us through his bio, as I know you do in chapter 1, so this will just be a teaser for you to read the chapter. But walk us through his bio and some of the main important experiences and moments for him.
So Howard Thurman was born on November 18th, 1899, near West Palm Beach, Florida. His family soon moved to Daytona Beach, where he basically lived with his 2 sisters, his mother and father and grandmother. However, his father died when he was at 7 years old. It was a very traumatic event for him in a variety of different ways, and certainly had great influence on some of his thinking later on as an adult and in theology. But he was mostly raised by his grandmother, who had been a former slave, and his mother. These were very prayerful women, very spiritual women, And I think he gained a lot from having both of them in his life in different ways. He was also a very bright student, and at that time, they only allowed black children to go to the 7th grade. So by de facto couldn't go on to high school. But the community got together and had him tutored so that he could get an 8th grade certificate, and then he went on to the Florida Baptist Academy. And here you have a young man who is, very sort of poor, working part-time jobs, yet he graduates valedictorian of his class. And as a result of graduating valedictorian, he earns a full tuition scholarship to Morehouse College here in Atlanta. And he graduates from Morehouse College as the valedictorian of the class. And there's this myth that he read every book in the library at the time. It's not clear about that. But he did, during the summer, take a couple of courses at Columbia in philosophy, et cetera. So he then went on to Colgate Rochester Theological Seminary and was one of their star students. He assumed his first position, the Mount Zion Baptist Church in Oberlin, Ohio, shortly after he graduated. He also got married then to Katie Kelly. They stayed there for a while. One of the problems that they ran into is that she had been a social worker in the tuberculosis association and contracted tuberculosis. So they had one child, but she sadly passed away. They moved back to Atlanta, where he had a joint position at Morehouse and Spelman College in the School of Religion as spiritual advisor. But while he was at Oberlin, he ran across a book called Finding the Trail of Life that had been written by Rufus Jones, who was a Quaker, a mystic. It was really about Rufus's childhood and being a mystic as a child. Well, Thurman spent quite a bit of time being in Daytona Beach, walking the beaches and wandering during the woods, and he was having these mystical experiences all the time. So to read about somebody else that had similar experiences, he thought, I've got to find this man and study with him. And so through and you'll understand this better when you read the book, but through a series of sacred synchronicities, he was able to connect to someone who knew Rufus Jones, and Rufus communicated with him, and he spent a semester at Haverford College studying mysticism. He was in his seminar, and Rufus Jones also opened up his library to him. So he was really interested in mysticism, Rufus Jones and Howard Thurman both being childhood mystics before they really knew anything about others and the whole area of mysticism. And so he started writing about mysticism and social change and got a lot of criticism for that. And so he sort of ignored it and continued to write about that. He was invited to on a pilgrimage to India in the mid-30s, and he and another couple, Edward and Fenella Carroll, spent 6 months giving lectures and talks. And at the end of that, they met with Gandhi. Now, I just want to take a little side note back here and say that it is known that Howard Thurman was writing about Jesus as a leader of a nonviolent religion back in the early 1930s. Yes. So they had a wonderful conversation, and somebody actually took notes, and it is a book called, Howard Thurman's Pilgrimage to India. And so, but they both talked. They talked about nonviolence, about love as the greatest force. It was just an extraordinary meeting between these two great men. And so when he came back, he was really very excited about this idea. He also had an experience in India where he had this vision at Khyber Pass, and he wondered whether or not people of different religions, people of different races and ethnicities could actually worship together in the same place. And so he was invited shortly after he was back to help co-found a church in San Francisco called the Church of the Fellowship of All Peoples, where they had the first intentional interracial, interethnic church in the United States. And they had a lot of members at large, including Eleanor Roosevelt. It was an amazing experience. But he was sort of lured away from, well, while he was there, he actually published the book, Jesus and the Disinherited. That was not his first book, but it was, obviously most popular book. And then afterwards, he was asked to join the faculty at Boston University and become dean of the Marsh Chapel. And he retired from there in 1965 and continued to lecture and give talks and travel. And he passed away on April 10th, 1981.
So there's so much there that's so exciting. So one of the things that I'm hoping that we'll focus on during Lent is this connection between the contemplative life and the active life, however you defined activism, public engagement, service, whatever that is. And Thurman is such an important example because he was sort of holding down the contemplative space for the people whose names we know readily, like Dr. King and also other leaders. But I want to sort of go back, and I'm guessing. So we're talking about this amazing figure that either you have or haven't yet heard about, and you'll read about. And we're talking about the contemplative life and mysticism as a child, and perhaps you're sitting there thinking, well, that's not me. I've never had any kind of mystical experience as a child or an adult. And one of the things that, and actually you'll have to remind me if this is his phrase or your phrase, but the idea of everyday mystics, that all of us can be a mystic, that all of us can grow and develop in our contemplative life. And I think one of the sort of ironies or creative tension in this is that in a real sense, if any of us have had a kind of experience we would say is mystical, some sense of really hearing God's voice or experiencing God's presence in a really transformative, powerful way, we probably understand it as gift, right? That it was given to us, it was initiated by God, and that is true. And at the same time, the encouragement of Thurman and of your own life and your book is that there are practices and postures that we can cultivate that make those experiences more likely. So I wonder if you would just help us reflect on that. What are some of those postures, practices, and just what's your understanding of that sort of creative tension of that we're waiting on God in a sense, but we're also coming into God's presence in a very intentional way?
Well, it's certainly one of the postures I think we need to have is a sense of openness, that that can be possible, and dedication or devotion to God. It's like when you think about it, how often do we say we're going to give time, not just on Sunday, but how often during the week are we going to give some time to God? Because we've got all these things going, we've got the to-do list going on, and we've got to be here, we've got to be there, but just like dedicated time to just be quiet with God.
Yeah.
So I think there's a, if in fact this is really a spiritual journey, how are we feeding our spirits, and how frequently, and for how long? Mm-hmm. Like, what are you doing that's feeding your spirit on a regular basis?
Yes.
And that can be, some form of contemplative prayer, but it also could be some creative activity that you're engaging in. Something that's not work, related or sort of pushing your agenda, but where you are sort of co-creating with God. So you could take a walk, you can play some music. I mean, I remember once I had in a retreat, people were looking at me a little strangely because I said, I want you to listen to the stillness in this music. And they were like, what? But wait, how can you have noise and have stillness? There can be stillness. I mean, stillness is kind of like a pulsating energy that we often feel in rural areas or, out in the country or whatever. But you can also see that in, a hawk, flying across the sky or clouds moving across the sky. But are you going to stop and just look at that? Or are you going to stop and look at a bee going from one flower to the next? So it's this pausing and paying attention to the presence of God, which is everywhere all the time. And we have all these opportunities, but we're just rushing past, right? Because, that's sort of our culture. That is, the culture of busyness. So it's actually intentionally, or perhaps maybe you might just be caught by surprise because you walk out and you see some beautiful sunset. Well, just, so be with that sunset. So we have, lots of opportunities to engage with God, but it doesn't have to be in a building, doesn't have to be at church, doesn't have to be on Sunday, it's just, so, and I think that's one of the gifts that we get from Thurman as well, because he said, the presence of God is just all around us.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it seems from Thurman's own life, he used the term sacred synchronicity, and in the book there's some other terms you use as well. And it seems like to me that an important part of even sort of the desire to rest in God's presence is a building, sense of relationship with this living God, which really means a kind of trust that's being developed, a kind of sense that God is guiding your own personal life in a way. And I love, there's a whole chapter on this where you, and really through perhaps Thurman's insights as well, talk about, on the one hand, there's some Christians that maybe make some of us nervous, I don't know, who would say, everything that happens is ordained by God and there's this blueprint plan, and it's sort of talking about this very kind of heavy sense of God's providence. And then on the other hand, it's easy for many of us to say, oh, well, what just happened? That was just chance or luck or whatever. But it seems like Thurman had kind of a middle road of being able to almost have a sort of a humble sense of God guiding him. So I wonder if you could help us both in his own life. There were some moments, right, that really, and then in your own life as well, of how to really cultivate. I mean, when we talk about trust, it's not just an abstract thing. It's a real, praying, seeing your own life unfold and the lives of other people unfold in relationship to the prayer and in relationship to your discernment. And so it's a growing trust and guidance. And can you speak to some of that?
Well, Thurman had lots of incidents that basically showed him that God was helping, right? Like, for example, when he got ready to go to the Florida Baptist Academy, he went to the train station, but they said his trunk was too big for his ticket, so he had no more money. And he had all the money that he had right with him. And so he sat down and he started crying. And this gentleman asked him why he was crying. A black man who I guess worked near the railroad. And he said, I wanted to go off to school, but I don't have any money and I can't. And he said, well, if you want to go get an education, boy, I'm going to pay for it, right? Let's go, right? Like, how does that happen? That you happen to be at the train station at the same time this person is there, right? So, so he had a number of those kinds of events. At the same time, he was very intentional about his discernment. So when they wanted him to come to Boston University to join the faculty, they kept saying, have you made a decision? He said, I'm waiting for a word in my heart. So it's just like many years ago, I was trying to decide whether or not I was going to go teach at Swarthmore College. I'd got an offer, right? I was living in Tennessee at the time. And I went up in the Smoky Mountains and I sat on a rock. And I sat there and sat there, until I heard an answer from the inside. And the answer was no. So I turned down this job with no other jobs in sight, just, I'm just going with that. We'll see what happens. And so, later I accepted a job at University of Colorado, but when it was time for my heart transplant, I'm talking to the surgeon and he casually says, well, I'm so glad that you are living out here because, there's a lot of centers vying for the same organs. You may not make it. So that decision that I had made, 5 years earlier in the Smoky Mountains, where I just sat there and listened till I heard an answer. And don't get me wrong. I mean, it would have been great to go off to Swarthmore and teach, but somehow or other that was the answer. So I just went with that.
So if you had gone to Swarthmore, it could have been a scenario in which you wouldn't have gotten a heart transplant.
Correct.
But because you were in Colorado,
Yes.
and you see that moment way back when you were praying and that no as connecting to that
Yes.
moment. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, it takes a real kind of boldness, right?
Yes.
To name that as God, I think, for us Episcopalians to say that was God and to connect those dots.
Well, or even to just, if you could just accept that it was the Holy Spirit.
Yes.
And that God has given us the Holy Spirit as an advisor, a counselor, and that if we're quiet enough, we hear the whispers of the Holy Spirit.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I noticed how you said, too, that the voice that you hear, the divine, is within. It comes within. It's the Holy
Yeah.
Spirit within us.
And it's not necessarily in words, although I've got what I call direct audibles, where I actually hear some words. But typically, it's not necessarily in words. It's like a feeling, like you need to call this person. Or, you need to go do such and such. And so it's that, and it's yielding to that. It's being humble enough to yield to that. And I think that as amazing as Howard Thurman was, he was always yielding to, that, in making his decisions.
And which means making sometimes unpopular decisions.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Whether it's not joining the civil rights movement in an active way, or
Right.
whether it's
Right.
leaving a great job. Yeah.
Right. I mean, he got pretty good at just saying, all right, you guys can call me crazy if you want, but this is what I'm doing. I mean, even when he went to start the church, people were just in an uproar. You're leaving Howard University, you're leaving all these great students in the School of Religion to go start some church, right? And he was like, yes. And you don't even know how you're going to get paid? He's like, yes. And he did. So he really was one who modeled for us how it's a balance between, pulling in all the facts, taking it in. I mean, I've done this many times. You take all the facts in, and then you sit and you listen.
And one of the concepts that you talk about in the book is inner authority. I love how there's a lowercase I, lowercase a, inner authority, and an uppercase I, uppercase a. So the lowercase inner authority is well, actually, why don't you should describe it instead of me.
Well, so, and this was just something that came out of listening and reading Thurman, but he's got a beautiful meditation and meditations of the heart. So if people are into reading something before they pray, meditations of the heart's a great place to start. And so he's got a beautiful meditation called The Inward Sea. And basically, it's really about your agency. Are you going to say yes or are you going to say no? Are you going to let this person influence you or are you not, right? So there's, moments when you need to act and say, no, I'm not going to participate in this, or, and I think I may have used, I guess I didn't in the book, but, I used the case of going to a car repair shop, and they give you this list of all these things that are not wrong with your car. And you can either leave your car there and let them charge you all that, or you can walk away. And I've done that. I got this, and I just said, do an oil change, and I went in and I got my car and left, right? So, and of course, I learned that in part from my mother, who back in the 50s, if she went into a store and somebody called her, referred to her as a girl, she turned around and walked out. And so I learned at a very young you don't have to take insults. You don't have to necessarily take negative behavior from other people, so you can walk away. So that's that sense of agency. Inner authority with a capital I and a capital A is the Holy Spirit living within us that we can always tap into. It's almost like you have your own personal GPS. I call it God positional system, operating system, right? You're walking around with the GPS with you. And so, but, are you willing, are you humble enough to say, I don't know if I should be making this decision alone? Or am I going to take the time and have the patience? Thurman has a beautiful meditation called, the unanswered prayer, right? How do we sit with a prayer that has not been answered? Do you have the patience, to be able to wait for the answer?
Yes. So inner authority is a kind of confidence that can be developed as you discern by listening to the Spirit, and then to act on,
Right.
even if it goes against what other people are wanting from you.
Right. And I think that Thurman really tried to encourage members of the civil rights movement, to pray before you act. And of course, they had incorporated this whole idea of centering down before you go out and deal with violent confrontation. That was part of the training. But that, it's important, and I think it's important now, particularly for young activists who are burning themselves out, right? That perhaps maybe you need to listen about what it is that is your sacred call, what is your role in the process, in all of this. And that is something that he told Martin Luther King when he got not shot, but stabbed in 1958. He started having visions of him, and so he told his wife, he said, I've got to go to New York and find him. And he found him actually in Harlem Hospital, and he said, look, this thing that you've started here has taken on a life of its own, and I think you need to take a little more time off and some silence and some solitude, so that you can understand what your role is going to be in all this. And so that's when after he took some extra time, he went to India to study nonviolence. But I think it is, and actually laid a wreath at the grave of Gandhi, because Gandhi had already died, right? And I didn't know that growing up. I thought King had studied with Gandhi, the whole thing, but that's not what happened. So, but and he sort of felt like we all have a sacred call. Every single person has a sacred call. And it is important for us to listen for that. As I tell people all the time, not everybody in the civil rights movement was on the street, right? You had people taking care of children, you had people cooking, you had people, making signs, you had artists, you had writers, you had musicians, you had all kinds of people that participated in moving that forward. So, I think sometimes people are afraid that, they have to be on the street. I don't need to be on the street. I don't need to be arrested. I have to take transplant meds every day, right? So that's not even practical. But I can do this.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And you use the example in terms of discerning, even in the moment of activism, that King and the other civil rights leaders did that, even like on Edmund Pettus Bridge, where one of the marches where they just stop and kneel down. And I guess when I first sort of saw that, I thought, I don't know what I thought, but I thought, well, this is kind of a strategic moment, they're praying, they're showing this is a Christian movement, but they're actually listening for the voice of God about what to do in that moment.
That was a great contemplative moment.
Yeah.
Right, where instead of just, you kneel down, you say a prayer, and I guess what he heard was, turn around. And so he turned everybody around.
Yes.
It was fabulous.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I want to ask one more question before we have a couple of minutes for comments and questions. I didn't assign for one of our discussion the chapter where you do go into depth about Jesus and the disinherited, even though it's a fabulous chapter and you should all read it. I hope you read the whole book. But I wanted to ask about that, and even more particularly, you were mentioning how, in a conversation that we had together, how important Thurman's idea about practicing the religion of Jesus.
Right.
So I wonder if you might share that.
Well, when Thurman was in India, at one of his stops, one of the, like a dean of a law school or something, pulled him aside afterwards and said, hey, I'd like to chat with you. And he said, why are you over here in India, sort of promoting Christianity? It's like you can't even sit in the same church with other Christians. He just, it went down the list, right? And so Thurman said, well, I actually don't refer to myself as a Christian. I refer to myself as a follower of the religion of Jesus. Not the religion about Jesus, the religion of Jesus. Like, what was Jesus doing every day? How did he treat people? What was his, his approach to life? And he said, and I think that's what we need to pay attention to. Jesus did a lot of praying. He took time away morning and evening. If you really start paying attention to him, it's like he was leading a contemplative life as well, right?
Yes.
He was never in a building. He was always outside, right? He always prayed first before he did anything. And he was kind and gentle. So, if you really and Thurman was such a scrutinizer of the Gospels. That's how he was able to write Jesus and the Disinherited. And, he said, if you really pay attention to what he was doing, that's very different from what has happened. There's a religion that has come that is based on the religion about Jesus as opposed to the religion of Jesus. And we need to get back to the religion of Jesus.
Do you think there's place for both, of and about? Or is the about Jesus has created too many sort of theological missteps that need to be corrected?
Thurman would say that if anything that is a barrier to the oneness of God is a problem. So, whether it's humanly imposed or whatever way it happens, and at the time there was this segregation, and there's still, not totally segregated churches, but segregated churches, by de facto, right? And so he was like, there should not be anything that, prevents a person from being able to worship God with all the other parts of God's creation. He believed we were one with everything, and that included all of creation, birds, trees, etc.
Yes.
So he was an early environmentalist.
Yes. So one last thing I just want to put out there, although we might not have too much time, because I am going to stop us and have question and answer. In Jesus and the Disinherited, he's writing as an African-American man in the early 20th century whose grandmother, who he was close to, was formerly enslaved. So that's how close he was to that history. His primary audience were African-Americans who were the disinherited, the oppressed. And so holding on to the importance of that, of his audience and who he's writing to, I also appreciate how you invite those of us who do not fit into that demographic or social location to say that he has great insights about what we do when we find ourselves in a situation where we have our backs up against the wall. It might be a work situation, it might be something else, where we can't quite navigate our way and change the external circumstances. And if I'm remembering right, he's talking about not acting in fear or duplicity or hatred. So I wanted to say that I appreciate how you've invited those of us that don't have the same social location to also have his insights, which are both political and personal, which
Right.
is so important to have both of those.
Yes. Well, I think regardless of your background, you're going to run into a situation where there's going to be a power differential.
Yes.
And if in fact you are working with someone who, is problematic, then you've got to figure out, well, so how am I going to deal with this circumstance? Am I going to be afraid of them? And live in fear, everywhere I go? Or am I going to give them a flattery that is not necessary or unnecessary? Or am I going to learn, to be bitter or hate them, et cetera? So, and, he always takes us back to the source. God is the source, right? So, if in fact you're in one of those situations, then maybe you need to be praying about what it is that you need to do. to either get yourself out of it or to move on. And so I often, and I've been in some of those situations where it's very clear that this is not this is not feeding me. This is not a healthy situation. And so, the Spirit has spoken and said, okay, it's time to get another job. Somehow or other that appears, right, at some point. So, but it's very interactive. I mean, it's like you can't expect that it's just going to all fall in your lap. Right. You have to do your part. But I think that those kinds of principles that he lays out in Jesus the Disinherited are applicable to any situation where there's a major power differential and you're being oppressed.
And if you can't get out of that situation, that's where the concepts like inner authority are so important, that you gain your own sense of confidence and agency to act and to,
And to have an accurate portrayal of yourself. He says that oftentimes we do not have an accurate portrayal of ourselves because we're listening to what everybody else has told us about us, right? Or the society has told us about us, or about the category that we're in. And that, you need to back up and think about, how did God create you? And these other things that people have imposed on you, you don't necessarily have to live that out.
Yes. So what we're being invited into for this book study in Lent is really to give us, not simply like to make us good people and good Christians that pray more, but really to give us resources and strengths and resilience and sort of spiritual strategies to grow our own sort of spiritual strength through the power of the Spirit. So I really encourage us to take advantage of this amazing book. But we have maybe 2 or 3 minutes, I'm so sorry, for 1 or 2 questions or comments. Would anyone, and we have Rebecca or Linda who's going to do the mic if we have. Does anyone have a comment or a question for Lerita? Yes, Barbara. Well, wait real quick, because we want the live stream to hear you.
Oh, thank you. I'm curious, do you know what essential agreements the Fellowship of All Peoples came to and how they came to them, and what sort of commitments held their church together since they weren't held together by doctrine?
They actually had a committee, of people and as well as the entire congregation, laid out a set of principles that they were going to live by and operate by. So they initially they were one of the co-founders wanted to be associated with the Presbyterian Church, and Thurman didn't want to be related to any denomination. So they had a very active working organization, both within the church in terms of how they laid out their principles. There's a book about the founding of the church called Footprints of a Dream, and it talks all about the founding of that church and the kinds of principles that they just chose to live by. Mm-hmm.
We have time for one more. Quick, David, yeah.
Thank you. Just a follow-up. Why did he not want to be part of a denomination? What was behind that?
Well, I think Thurman had some serious issues with Christianity as it evolved. He felt like somehow or other it got corrupted. And so, this whole issue of, fights between denominations, we're better than this other one, et cetera. He said, God is not interested in that. God didn't set it up like that. He said, he wants us to be one. He wants us to be connected to each other. And so he felt like that was another one of those humanly imposed barriers, keeping people from having that, not only that connection, but that sense of presence of God. Yes. I'm sure you'll have more questions after you read the book.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So come with your questions and insights to the 4 weeks. What is 2 weeks from today? Is it March 6th? What is today? Yeah, March 16th. And then plus 7 is what? 23, 30, and April 6th, I think. So it's the 4 in a row that we'll be gathering together. And there will be handouts to help us along.
Oh.
So please join me in thanking again Lerita Coleman Brown. Dr. Brown, thank you so much. Thank you.